what if I told you that the exact mathematical formula to outpace inflation in Silver Spring today was actually carved into a piece of dirt in the Middle East, like over 5,000 years ago?
I mean, it sounds crazy when you put it like that.
Right, because we tend to look at antiquity as this disconnected, dusty realm, like it has absolutely nothing to do with modern algorithmic subscriptions or the housing market. But human behavior, especially how we panic, how we covet, and how we accumulate resources, it just hasn't changed a bit.
It really hasn't. The environmental variables changed, obviously, but the underlying equation of human nature remained entirely static.
Yeah.
And the text we are looking at today, The Richest Man in Babylon, it's essentially a behavioral economics manual, but it's just disguised as ancient parables.
Disguised as parables, exactly. And our mission for this deep dive is to basically extract that manual and apply it strictly to your life right now. We are translating these 5,000-year-old mechanics to address the very real friction of living in America today.
Right, like dodging modern financial traps, managing the cost of living, and navigating that heavy cultural pressure of sending money home.
Exactly. And the source material, it wastes zero time getting to the psychological root of the problem. Chapter 1 doesn't open with an ancient spreadsheet or anything.
No spreadsheets.
It introduces an archetype, this chariot builder, who is sitting on a wall experiencing what we would now call severe crisis of upward comparison.
Yeah, he's just staring at the extreme wealth of Babylon and feeling fundamentally paralyzed by the gap between their reality and his own.
Right. And he represents the necessary psychological baseline for any wealth accumulation. Like, he is exhausted by his own poverty. But rather than just wallowing in the disparity, he recognizes a flaw in his own understanding.
He shifts from a state of passive resentment to active inquiry.
Yes.
He realizes that staring at someone else's surplus doesn't actually teach you the mechanism of how they acquired it.
To bring that to the present, sitting on that Babylonian wall is the mechanical equivalent of modern-day algorithmic envy.
Oh, absolutely. Doom scrolling.
Doom scrolling. You sit on your couch in Silver Spring, you're scrolling through social media, absorbing this highly curated feed of other people's vacations, their real estate acquisitions, and their seemingly effortless success.
And you absorb that disparity, which breeds a very specific kind of bitterness.
Right. But you aren't actually reverse engineering their success. You're just, consuming the gap.
Consuming the gap. I like that. And consuming that gap actively drains the cognitive energy you need to actually change your circumstances. The text contrasts this chariot builder with another figure later on, a man who actually begins his life as a slave.
Oh, right. The slave archetype.
Yeah. And this second figure, he completely removes the concept of fairness from his worldview. Like, he doesn't rely on starting conditions at all. He relies entirely on internal mechanics.
Just sheer output.
Sheer output, consistency, and highly calculated decisions. The lesson demands an absolute, almost ruthless internal locus of control.
Because simply desiring success is a passive state.
Exactly. Accumulation requires moving into an active state of planning and execution.
So the mandate here is that if you want to build wealth, you have to operate under the assumption that your success is entirely dependent on your own actions, regardless of the starting line.
Yes, 100%.
But if I'm looking at this from a macro perspective, it's very easy for a proverb to say, focus on your own effort. But we are talking about living in a modern economy with verifiable systemic hurdles.
Sure.
Like, inflation degrades purchasing power in real time. The barrier to entry for home ownership in places like Maryland is just objectively higher than it was a generation ago. Does the text just expect the reader to ignore structural economic flaws?
Well, no. The philosophy doesn't claim the system is flawless or even fair. Ancient Babylon was a brutal hierarchy driven by slave labor and extreme class divides.
Right. It definitely wasn't an economic utopia.
Exactly. The point the source is making is really about resource allocation, specifically, the allocation of your own mental bandwidth. Okay. If you spend your limited cognitive energy analyzing and criticizing the macroeconomic hurdles, well, you have less energy available to navigate them. You don't have to agree with the structure of the modern economy to mathematically hack it.
You acknowledge the inflation, you acknowledge the housing market, and then you immediately pivot all your focus to the variables you actually control.
Your discipline, your skill acquisition, and your daily capital allocation.
That distinction makes a lot of sense. You aren't denying the storm. You are just refusing to stand in the rain complaining about the clouds while you could be, building a shelter.
Building a shelter, exactly.
So the internal locus of control is the spark. But psychological readiness doesn't automatically generate capital. You can't hand a landlord a jar of internal locus of control.
No, they generally prefer cash.
Right. So how does the text actually define the mechanics of building the pile of gold?
Well, it introduces a concept that has been widely repeated in modern personal finance, but the source material explains the why much better than most contemporary advice. The core mechanic, introduced by the figure who eventually becomes the richest man in the city, is to pay yourself first.
Pay yourself first.
Yes. The mandate is to capture 10 to 20% of all capital inflow before any other transaction occurs.
You know, people who follow personal finance here pay yourself first constantly.
All the time.
But it often gets misinterpreted as, like, treat yourself, or just transferring whatever is miraculously left over at the end of the month into a savings account.
Right, which never works.
Never. But the mechanism the text describes is entirely different. It's not about saving what's left. It's about establishing an automated toll booth on your own labor before the money even enters your mental accounting space.
The behavioral psychology behind that is critical. If capital lands in your primary checking account, human nature dictates that your lifestyle will immediately expand to consume that capital.
Lifestyle creep.
Exactly, lifestyle creep. The ancient advice to carve out the 10% first bypasses this psychological urge. You are mathematically, artificially constraining your own supply.
So for the listener in Silver Spring, this means that 10 to 20% is redirected the absolute moment the paycheck clears.
Yes.
You capture it before rent, before the utility bills, and crucially, before you send any money home.
Which is hard for a lot of people to hear.
It's incredibly hard. It's exactly like the airplane safety rule of securing your own oxygen mask before helping others. If you don't secure your 10 to 20% first, you eventually suffocate financially.
And then you can't sustainably pay your bills or send money home anyway.
Exactly. You skim the cream off the top of the milk before the bottle ever reaches the marketplace, because if you wait until the end of the month, the friction of daily life in America will guarantee there is no cream left.
And the text supports this by introducing what they call the clay tablets, which is essentially the ancient blueprint for zero-based budgeting.
Clay tablets as a budgeting app.
Basically. They observe that a high income provides absolutely no protection against poverty if the outflow isn't meticulously tracked. You have to assign a strict purpose to the remaining 80 to 90% of your income.
You have to actively identify the modern leaks.
Right. The overlapping streaming services, the convenience of food delivery apps, the impulse purchases, and plug them.
So the mechanics of accumulation aren't about some secret investment vehicle. It's just creating a rigid, unyielding gap between what you earn and what you consume, and aggressively defending that gap.
That's the entire secret.
And mathematically, if you do that, the surplus has nowhere to go but up. You will accumulate capital. But the moment you actually have a surplus, the environment around you changes.
Oh, it changes drastically.
Right. A pile of liquidity exerts a gravitational pull. It attracts risk.
Sudden liquidity is incredibly dangerous if you haven't built the infrastructure to protect it. The source actually shifts here from offensive accumulation to defensive preservation, using the metaphor of the walls of Babylon.
The defensive perimeter.
Exactly. These walls were a massive architectural feat designed to protect the city's internal wealth from external siege.
But the modern siege isn't an invading army. It's a blown transmission on your car. It's a sudden round of corporate layoffs. It's an out-of-network medical emergency.
The literal translation for today is a liquid, fully funded 3 to 6 month emergency reserve. That reserve is your structural wall.
Because if you deploy all your capital into the market or tie it all up in illiquid assets without building that foundational wall first,
then a single external shock can force you to liquidate your investments at a massive loss. The text emphasizes that wealth without a defensive perimeter is just temporary.
And the perimeter doesn't just protect you from external shocks. It protects you from internal miscalculations.
Right, from yourself.
From yourself. The text outlines specific laws of gold, which basically serve as a firewall against human greed. Because when you have money, you suddenly become very susceptible to people offering you a shortcut to double it.
The laws dictate that capital flees from those who force it into impossible earnings, or who trust it to the inexperienced.
So in the context of today's market, this is the psychological defense against the hype cycle.
Absolutely. It's the discipline to walk away from unregulated crypto schemes, algorithmic trading bots promising guaranteed returns, or whatever the current speculative mania happens to be.
You restrict your capital deployment to assets where the underlying value mechanism is transparent and proven, like broad market index funds or established real estate.
You protect the capital from the scammers, and you protect it from the market.
But the source material introduces a third threat that I think is going to resonate deeply with our listener. The text brings in an archetype, the gold lender, who spends his days evaluating people asking for money.
Yes, Manthon the gold lender.
Right. And his core philosophy introduces a massive point of cultural fiction for anyone living in the U.S. who is trying to build wealth while simultaneously supporting an extended family network.
The lender's rule is absolute. You only deploy capital where the mathematical probability of return is overwhelmingly high, and you do not underwrite the liabilities of others if it compromises your own foundation.
And this is where the ancient math collides violently with modern cultural reality.
This is a very harsh collision.
We are looking at a listener who likely feels a profound, almost non-negotiable obligation to send money home, to assist siblings, or to act as the financial safety net for their parents. The textbook says, protect your capital, but reality says, my family member is facing eviction.
Right.
How does the text reconcile the very human desire to be generous with the cold, protective mandate of wealth accumulation?
Well, it addresses this by distinguishing between enabling an unsustainable situation and truly empowering someone.
Okay, unpacking that.
The source suggests that if you assume the financial burdens of your friends or family without evaluating the root cause of their distress, you aren't actually solving their problem. You're simply transferring their structural instability onto your own balance sheet.
Wow. It's like a structural load limit in architecture.
Exactly.
If you have an unfinished foundation and you invite everyone you know to come stand on it, the entire structure eventually collapses under the weight. You don't save them. You just guarantee that all of you get crushed in the rubble.
The math is entirely unsentimental about this. True generosity requires a permanent surplus.
A permanent surplus.
Yes. If you constantly interrupt your own compounding cycle to bail out relatives, you remain stuck in the middle class. And that effectively caps your ability to provide meaningful generational help later.
So you have to establish incredibly rigid boundaries around your core capital. You secure your own financial independence first so that when you do give, you are giving from the overflow, not from the foundation.
Exactly. And setting those boundaries requires a level of interpersonal friction that most people will do anything to avoid.
Oh, definitely. Saying no to someone you love because it violates your capital allocation strategy is deeply uncomfortable.
Very uncomfortable. But the text argues that this discomfort is just the unavoidable price of entry for long-term stability.
Let's pivot to the reality of execution, though. Because even with the walls built and the boundaries set, humans are fallible.
We made mistakes.
What happens when the disciplined person still messes up? What happens when you make a bad calculation and end up in a hole?
The source approaches failure through the narrative of Dabasir, a camel trader who finds himself completely overwhelmed by debt. And his initial reaction is highly instructive because it mirrors the modern physiological response to overwhelming liabilities.
Which is?
He flees. He tries to avoid the reality of his balance sheet.
Right. When the credit card statements pile up and the interest is compounding against you, the human instinct is to literally throw the mail in a drawer unopened.
Just hide it away.
It's a literal stress response. We avoid looking at the numbers because the math induces shame.
But the trader's redemption only begins when he reverses that behavior. He stops fleeing, he returns to the city, and he actively calls his creditors.
He faces it.
He faces it. He doesn't ask for a magical pardon. He takes absolute ownership of the liabilities and negotiates a systematic mathematical repayment plan using a portion of his future labor.
So for the listener in Silver Spring, if you realize you've fallen into a modern debt trap, maybe you financed a vehicle you couldn't afford, or you leveraged credit cards to maintain a lifestyle, the blueprint demands that you strip away the shame immediately.
You don't get to hide behind the predatory nature of modern interest rates.
No. You sit down at the kitchen table, you pull every single statement, you look the exact number in the eye, and you restructure your entire lifestyle to systematically dismantle that debt.
You weaponize your income against the liability until it's gone.
Weaponize your income. I love that.
It is really the only way to reclaim the psychological bandwidth needed to build wealth, because debt isn't just a financial drain. It is a cognitive anchor.
Yeah, until you dismantle it, your focus is entirely consumed by survival.
Right. But once the debt is cleared, that same systemic discipline can be redirected toward spotting and acting on opportunity, which the text conceptualizes as the goddess of good luck.
The concept of luck is fascinating here because they don't treat it as a random atmospheric event, like a lottery ticket falling from the sky.
No, they frame it through a story of a man who missed a massive return on an investment simply because he wanted to sleep on the decision.
He hesitated.
He hesitated. The consensus they reach is that luck is essentially the velocity of action applied to a high probability opportunity.
Velocity of action.
Yes. The universe frequently presents asymmetric risks, situations where the potential downside is relatively capped, but the upside is substantial. The defining characteristic of people who seem lucky is their willingness to execute immediately when they spot one of these asymmetries.
We see this constantly today. The modern equivalent of hesitating on that trade is sitting on your couch overthinking a side hustle for 2 years.
Oh, all the time.
You notice a gap in the market in Silver Spring, maybe a service business or a niche for content creation. You draft the business plan, you research the LLC structures, you debate the logo colors, and you wait for the perfect moment.
And while you are demanding perfect alignment, someone else launches an imperfect version of the exact same idea and captures the market.
Luck isn't a winning lottery ticket. It's a door you have to be willing to kick open the second you see a crack of light.
Hesitation penalizes you because markets are dynamic. The blueprint demands that when you identify an opportunity that aligns with your acquired skills, you merge into the traffic immediately. You don't wait for the road to be completely empty.
You launch the imperfect product.
You start the hustle with whatever capital you have available. That momentum, that sheer willingness to act while others are still deliberating, is what the outside world misidentifies as luck.
So if we pull all these ancient mechanics together and lay them over a modern map of Silver Spring, we are looking at a highly aggressive, deeply unsentimental behavioral loop.
Very unsentimental.
You construct an internal locus of control, refusing to blame the system. You establish a toll booth on your own labor, capturing the capital before it can be consumed by your lifestyle.
You build the structural walls by hoarding liquidity for emergencies. You deploy the surplus into proven, unhyped assets.
You ruthlessly defend the foundation from the liabilities of others, regardless of cultural expectations. You systematically dismantle your own mistakes without shame. And you act with extreme velocity when an asymmetric opportunity presents itself.
Earn, capture, protect, deploy, repeat.
The geography of where you live provides access to an economy with a staggering amount of liquidity flowing through it every single day. But proximity to capital doesn't mean anything if you don't build the internal machinery to capture and retain it.
The Babylonian blueprint works because math doesn't care what era you live in. The variables are modern, but the formula is absolute.
Before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to chew on regarding that friction we discussed earlier, the intense discomfort of saying no to family to protect your capital. We talk so much about the concept of generational wealth, and we almost always define it as passing down a massive portfolio or a paid-off piece of real estate.
Right, the tangible assets.
But what if the most valuable piece of generational wealth you can possibly transfer to your family isn't a liquid asset at all? What if the greatest, most transformative gift you can give them is the deeply uncomfortable, highly unpopular discipline of refusing to enable their bad financial habits today?